Good evening and a very warm welcome on behalf of the Jewish Historical Society of England Leeds branch and on behalf of MILIM to this evening's presentation. Welcome wherever you are in the UK and indeed wherever you are in the world. And once again, I'm pleased to welcome our viewers from around the globe, including Australia tonight. So welcome to you. Our series of online talks and conversations continues with our guest Simon Goulden, whom I will introduce in just a moment. First, a little bit of housekeeping. You're welcome to ask questions. Please do this by typing in whatever you'd like to ask into the Q&A facility on your screen. And as ever, we will try our best to get through as many of your questions as we can. Can I also draw your attention to the chat facility? This allows you to send a message to all of the other participants on this webinar, should you wish to do so. Finally, this event is being recorded and will be available in the coming days on our website at milim.org.uk. There you can find recordings of other past events and details of our future programme for which you can book tickets. And so to our guest. Simon Goulden is an education and management consultant, a writer and an international lecturer. Initially qualifying in civil engineering, he switched to education management, leading the Agency for Jewish Education for many years. He recently obtained his MA in Jewish Education from LSJS, the London School of Jewish Studies. Simon has authored, edited, and acted as a consultant on Jewish prayer books and books about Judaism, Jewish history, and Israel. He also lectures and leads museum tours at LSJS. This evening, Simon is speaking about Jewish lives in Georgian England. Simon, a very warm welcome to you. We're delighted to have you. And without further ado, I'll hand over and we're listening with anticipation.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jonathan. And good evening, everybody. I'm going to start by sharing my screen and see what we can do. Oh, that's not quite gone right. Help. I do apologize, it didn't quite work. Let's try again. Share screen and desktop, that's it. No, it hasn't worked. Oh dear.
Start PowerPoint.
Share the screen. And there we are. And we've got there in the end, I'm delighted to say. So everybody, ladies and gentlemen, it's absolute a delight to be with you. And as the slide says, we're talking about funding Falmouth and Fish&Chips. I'd really like to say what a treat it is to be lecturing to MILIM again. And a good evening to those people in the UK. Good afternoon to those people further to our west, and good morning indeed to people much further south. And we'll actually be dealing with all of those areas of the world in one way or another in the next hour or so. And the Georgian period runs from 1714 to more or less 1830 to 1837, depending on how you want to decide on its end. Now, indulge me, please, everybody. I'm going to be a little bit flexible in my timing because I want to have a tour through some of the highlights and indeed some of the lowlights in the Anglo-Jewish community. We won't be taking a linear route because I like the byways more than the highways, and we'll be traveling the length and breadth of the country and indeed much further beyond. And as an example, I'd like to start with our first gentleman. He's Samson Gideon. He was almost an Englishman. Samson Gideon was born in 1699 and he died in 1762. He was actually born in London. He was born in London Wall in the city of London, and he was the second of 5 children of a man called Roland Gideon. But of course, Roland Gideon wasn't Roland Gideon. Originally, he was Abudiente, and he traded in goods and from the West Indies. And he had Samson with his second wife, Esther, also a nice Jewish girl, daughter of Domingo or Abraham de Porto. And he was a diamond buyer in Madras, India. And just if you think that the Jewish world was a very small world. We're talking about at a time at the turn of the 17th century of Jews already trading in Madras, which is on the eastern coast of India, trading in diamonds and precious stones. Samson Gideon was regarded as a trusted advisor to the government. And I'll just show you how trusted he was. Let's take ourselves back to the year 1745. The Jacobite army, supporters of the Catholic pretender to the English or British throne, trounces the British regular army at the Battle of Preston Pans. And they are heading south towards London. There is panic in London. There's a run on the Bank of England. And amongst the most prominent financiers in the city at the time was our man, Samson Gideon. And he regularly floated in loans on behalf of His Majesty's government. It's alleged that Samson Gideon reportedly stabilized the British finances by establishing a credit line of some £1,700,000. Now, that doesn't sound a lot today, but its estimated buying value now is somewhere in the order of £20 billion sterling. And he did this on his own. No wonder he was so trusted. Because he was born in Britain, he possessed most, but not all, of the rights of an Englishman, because Jews, Catholics, and non-conformist Anglicans could not attend university. They couldn't work as an attorney. They couldn't be appointed to any public office or indeed become members of parliament. Samson Gideon wanted all of those, and he wanted social acceptance. After all, he was a natural-born Englishman. So what could he do? He lobbied government for a baronetcy. A baronetcy is a knighthood which doesn't end with the death of the knight, but actually carries on through the lineage. But he couldn't get one because he was not a member of the Church of England. So what is a nice Jewish boy to do? He goes and marries a Christian woman called Jane, who is the daughter of a very wealthy man, and he resigns his membership of the Sephardi synagogue, the first built synagogue in the city of London, and in fact still in existence in Bevis Marks. He buys a country estate and he makes sure that his son inherits it. He's already had a son and a daughter from this non-Jewish woman. This now Anglican 15-year-old boy, he becomes, amazing enough, Sir Sampson in 1758, and he's sent to Eton College, and his marriage is negotiated with the daughter of Sir John Eardley Wilmot, who just happened to be the Chief Justice of Common Pleas. And he makes sure that the son changes his name to Eardley. He then secures his daughter's marriage to Viscount Gage, a member of the British aristocracy, with a dowry that was the equivalent of today's money, and I've got to be very flexible, but in the order of £30 million dowry. Now, there's no suggestion, of course, that the dowry in any way influenced the love match between the two. Sadly, Samson Gideon dies of dropsy, what we now call edema, in Belvedere House in Erith in Kent, southeast of London, in October 1762, aged 63. And he left a fortune which is currently estimated at about £40 million today. He leaves £1,000 in old money to the Sephardi Jewish community in London. It's worth about £1.25 million now, on condition that he's buried as a Jewish man as a Jewish married man in the Spanish and Portuguese synagogue cemetery in Mile End, and that still exists today. You see, even though he had formally resigned from the synagogue and the community, he'd actually continued to pay his shul fees every year until his death under the name of Almoni Peloni, which of course is a variation of Ploni Almoni, which you can find in the book of Ruth, which is almost like saying Mr. A.N. Other. Of course, his children weren't halachically Jewish, and that's just as well, because the son, having been baptized and married and found himself as the MP for Cambridgeshire from 1770 to 1780, making a nice link with what poor old Samson Gideon couldn't get, which was a parliamentary seat. Moving right along, we have a sort of a sad tale, really, or was it? And we're going to bump into characters written by Dickens several times this afternoon, or this evening, or this morning, depending on where you are on the globe. So this is a lady called Judith Hart Levy. After the death of Benjamin Levy in 1702, his son Elias becomes a ward of court of somebody called Moses Hart. And we'll come across Moses Hart a little later as well. Moses Hart is a big wheeler and dealer in the Jewish community. And Elias spends some time in Richmond visiting Heron Court, and he decides that he's not going to become a rabbi, even though he could have done, but he wants to become a man of business and finance. So Moses Hart had charge of the £80,000 which the lad had inherited. That's about 8.5 million in today's money. And he invested in the South Sea Company, which the stock had grown by, at that time, something in the order of 600%. But Elias reckoned that it was time to sell out. And he wanted to do that, even though the man who was his ward was refusing to do so. He goes to court, pleads his case as a minor, and says, I want the right to sell my stock. Indeed, he actually does that, which is quite amazing, because he sells out just before the South Sea bubble bursts. He stole the stock, and at an estimated value in these days, somewhere in the order of £5.5 billion sterling. Now, impressed by the lad's financial nous, Moses forgives him. And later, indeed, the lad becomes engaged to one of Moses' daughters, Judith. He had 5 daughters. The marriage was considered a great match because both parties brought good looks, intelligence, and enormous wealth. You see, Judith had initially been given a dowry by her father of just £10,000, or a little shy of 1.25 million in today's money. But she argued this wasn't enough. She learned that her sisters had got much more than her, and she demanded an increase, and in fact found out that she got the increase. Together, Judith and Elias worked and maintained and indeed increased their fortune. They engaged in the Lisbon diamond trade. They were government contractors, and they also financed what was politely called privateers. They were state-sponsored pirates, to put not too fine a point on it. And Judith spent a lot of time in the finance house trying to save money, because she thought if she could do the job, then they didn't need to employ staff. She was brilliant, she was witty, she was accomplished, and her husband called her Minerva in skirts, because she was brilliant at business. And sadly, her husband, Elias, dies at the age of 50, and a number of her children died in infancy. Only one daughter and one son reached adulthood, and she settles permanently in Richmond Green in southwest London, fairly close to Wimbledon Tennis Club, but not so close, and she became a focus of local society. In fact, she became known as the Queen of Richmond Green. She lived modestly to begin with, but not now, and she spent quite grandly, although her income was only about £8 million a year in today's money, so she couldn't be too lavish. But there's a pattern that you'll see emerging. She arranges for her daughter, Isabella, to marry into a titled Christian family. And she marries the Honourable Lockhart Goulden by special license. The marriage was arranged through the help of her close friend, the Duchess of Northumberland, at Syon House. And those of you who are, I think, members of English Heritage, you can go to Syon House now. In fact, it's open to the public and is a wonderful house and beautiful gardens. I thoroughly recommend it next time you're in London. Sadly, the marriage doesn't last very long because Isabella, the daughter, dies after 11 months. However, and I say however, there's a midrash. There's a story that goes that actually the daughter dies on the day of her wedding, and her mother, Judith Hart-Levy, locks the house up, and it remains exactly as it was on the day of the wedding. The wedding feast laid at the table, all the decorations and everything, and the house is just left, and she goes into terminal decline. Now, that's not true, but it's a great story, and it's a story which may have well been the model for Charles Dickens to call Miss Havisham in Great Expectations. And you can see a picture we have of her, and she could well have been Miss Havisham. When she dies, she leaves about, in today's money, about £6 million. She's burnt through quite a bit of the cash and given a lot of it away. And she actually gives away a large amount of money to the cost of rebuilding the Great Synagogue in the city of London. And she did leave really a life of seclusion towards the end, and you can understand it. Husband's died, only daughter has died at a very young age, and you can understand perhaps how she became a recluse. And she too was buried in the Jewish cemetery in Mile End. Now I want to move away a little bit, and you'll have to, I crave indulgence from those people who aren't particularly familiar with the British prayer book system, because after Haftarah on a Shabbat and a Yom Tov, we say the prayer for the royal family, and it's a prayer that is familiar to most of us in the United Kingdom, and indeed perhaps in the Commonwealth, because it always starts, "He who giveth salvation to kings." And for many years when I was a child, I actually thought that, like the Shema begins with the word Shema, and then Ashrei begins with Ashrei, I thought this prayer was actually called the He Who, but it wasn't. This is a prayer, a picture of a prayer book from King George V, which would be about 100 years ago, and I'm going to read it to you very briefly. "He who giveth salvation unto kings and dominion to princes, whose kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, who delivered his servant David from the hurtful sword, who maketh a way in the sea and the path in mighty waters, may he bless, guard, protect and help, exalt, magnify and highly aggrandize our sovereign Lord King George, blah, 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 blah. May the supreme King of kings in his mercy preserve the king in life, guard her and deliver him from all trouble, sorrow and hurt. May he make his enemies lie before him. May the supreme King of kings in his mercy put a spirit of wisdom and understanding into his heart and into the heart of all his counselors, that they may uphold the peace of the realm, advance the welfare of this nation, and deal kindly and truly with all Israel. In his days and in ours, may Judah be saved, Israel dwell securely. May the Redeemer come unto Zion, that this may be his will. And let us say Amen. And you will recognize that it's almost identical to the prayer that we say every week in shul. However, you may be surprised to learn that, as we know, the idea of praying for the welfare of the government goes back thousands of years. 2,500 years ago, the prophet Jeremiah was already exhorting his captives in Babylon to work to see the city where I sent you enjoys peace and prosperity. We know in the Mishnah it says, pray for the welfare of the government, for if it wasn't for this, the fear of it, people would swallow one another alive, which is a nice trick if you can get away with it. But that clearly is not the vegan option. But what's interesting to me, and maybe interesting to you, is that in 1656, when Manasseh ben Israel wrote to Oliver Cromwell, and here he is, warts and all, Oliver Cromwell, he wrote a prayer for the safety of the Lord Protector, because that's what his title. This is what Manasseh ben Israel wrote, and I will read it to you. He who giveth salvation to kings and dominion to lords, delivereth his servant David from the sword of the enemy. He that makes way in the sea and a path in the strange waters, bless, keep, preserve, and rescue, exalt and magnify, lift up higher and higher, our Lord Protector, King of kings, defend in his mercy, make him joyful, free from all dangers and distress. King of kings, for his goodness' sake, raise up and exalt his planetary star, multiply his days over his kingdom. King of kings, for his mercy's sake, put into his heart and into the hearts of all his counselors and those who attend and minister to him, that he may show mercy to us and to all the people of Israel. In his days and in ours, let Judah be safe, Israel dwell securely. Let the Redeemer come to Israel, and may it please God. Amen. So amazing, in my mind, amazingly, that 350 years after Manasseh ben Israel writes this prayer on behalf of the Lord Protector, Oliver Cromwell, through changes in leadership, back to a monarchy, through Georgian, Victorian, Edwardian, and now at our current time, Elizabethan, the new Elizabethan age. That prayer, almost, I won't say word for word, but with many phrases that have been there throughout the centuries, those are still the prayers of the Jewish people in Britain for the safety of the government. Now back to our story. And a man called Mayor Lyons. Really, it's quite an amazing story. Mayor Lyons lived in London from an early age, and he was talent spotted by a man called Isaac Pollock, who was the Chazan of the Great Synagogue in the centre of London. The Great Synagogue was the most important Ashkenazi synagogue in London at the time. He was appointed by Isaac Pollock as a meshorer, or a choir boy, in 1767 at a salary of £40 a year, which was a big amount of money, on the understanding that he was to behave as a Yehudi kasher, a righteous, an ehrlich Yid. He had a very high voice. It was almost falsetto, and people began to listen to this amazing voice, and the actor David Garrick wanted to use him on the secular stage in the Opera House. Mayor Lyons was given permission by the synagogue elders to appear on stage, where he adopted the name Michael Leone, and you can see how Mayor Lyons becomes Michael Leone, and he was given permission to do so, but he had to stick to halachic rules. So he had this twin-track career in the synagogue and the musical theatre. And between 1770 and 1782, he appeared quite frequently on stage. Thomas Arne wrote the opera Artaxerxes, and he stars in it. Sheridan writes the Duena at Covent Garden Theatre, And it's interesting, the newspaper, one of the newspapers at the time, the Morning Chronicle, says that he was, I quote, "It can never be performed on a Friday on account of Leonie's engagement with the synagogue." So it was crucial to the piece's success that Leonie, Mayor Lyons, was performing in it. So if you wanted to hear it done properly, don't go on a Friday night. He actually got a lot of admirers amongst non-conformist Christians as well. A number of non-Jews would go along to the synagogue on a Friday night to hear Mayor Lyons perform. And particularly one of them, a man called Olivers, was so impressed by Lyons' rendition of Yigdal that he wanted to write words to it of a Christian nature using the tune. The result is, and you can find it, ladies and gentlemen, if you look at it on YouTube, in Hymns Ancient and Modern, which is the Church of England hymn book, and it's called The God of Abraham Praise. Now, I didn't have a clip of the music here, but I believe others can do that. So God of Abraham Praise. That is actually the story of Yigdal. Right, so what happened to Mayor Lyons? Well, he was sufficiently famous that he gives sort of like private soirees. And by that time, a number of the wealthy Jews were moving out of London and to the suburbs, which has been the habit of wealthy Jews over many, many years. And he sang in the fashionable houses outside when they were holding entertainments. In November 1774, he sang at the house of one Aaron Franks, who was an extremely wealthy man, who had a home in Isleworth. And those of you who know your London airport, it's very close to London Airport. I'm not sure whether it's actually on the runway or in Terminal 4, but it's fairly close too. Interestingly enough, this Aaron Franks was married to another daughter of Moses Hart. Remember him? He had a daughter called Judith Hart. You remember the whole story there. Anyway, he's quite an important man out. And this is him. This is Moses Hart. Moses Hart actually was the founder of the Duke's Place Synagogue in London, which was the great synagogue. By the way, he happened to be the brother of Rabbi Aaron Hart, who was the chief rabbi. Funny that, isn't it? And in the audience of this soiree was Horace Walpole, the famous diarist and essayist, and he gave a description that goes like this. I was at a very fine concert at Old Frank's in Isleworth and heard Leonie, who pleased me more than anything I have heard these 100 years. There's a full melancholy melody in his voice, though a falsetto that nothing but the natural voice ever compasses. Then he sang songs of Handel in a genuine, simple style. So it's clear that our man Leonie was able to span the Jewish and the non-Jewish world, but things didn't quite go as well as he hoped. The money wasn't up to much, and he had the idea that he would be able to strike out on his own. He's gone again. Come back. Strike out on his own and become a theatre impresario. It was a disaster. He puts on Handel's Messiah in Dublin. Remember, of course, Dublin was, as far as people in Georgian Britain were concerned, very much an important city in Britain. But it didn't work out. He lost money. Maybe audiences were beginning to grate with this voice. They didn't really like it. So he loses money. He has a number of benefit concerts at Covent Garden Theatre in 1787 and 1788, but things weren't going very well. He's not an old man. He's only in his mid-30s, but he gives up and he decides to sail to Jamaica to become the chazan of the community in Kingston. And yes, there was a large and thriving Jewish community in Kingston in those days, sufficient to say that a little later on in the story, the Parliament in Kingston would not meet on Yom Kippur because there weren't enough members of the legislature to make a quorum. Where was the quorum? They were all in shul next door. So, but anyway, that's a side story. He dies, unfortunately, in 1797, and he's buried actually in the Jewish cemetery in Eltham Road in Kingston. That's an interesting story. That's perhaps one that you wouldn't normally have heard of. And if you're looking for interesting stories, try this for size. Lord George Goulden. Possibly one of the weirdest stories that you'll ever hear. He's born in London in 1751, December 1751, the third and youngest son of Cosmo George Goulden, who's the third Duke of Goulden, and his wife Catherine. He's a proper aristocrat. He's educated at Eton. He enters the Royal Navy at the ripe old age of 12, as they did in those days, and got promoted to the rank of lieutenant. But his career stagnates and he doesn't get any further promotions. And one of the suggestions is that he actually took an interest in the welfare of the seamen and the regular sailors rather than looking after his own career and advancement. He was much loved by the sailors, but indeed not by the hierarchy of the Royal Navy. And Lord Sandwich, who was the head of the Admiralty at that time, refused to promote him and give him any command of a ship. So he resigns his commission in 1772. In 1774, in the general election, he's returned unopposed as a member of Parliament for Ludgershall in Wiltshire. It's what was known as a pocket borough. It's basically a stitch up so that important people could get themselves into Parliament. He had an interesting parliamentary career. I say interesting because he wasn't afraid to speak out and criticize anybody and everybody. He was very much an opponent of the government's colonial policy in regards to North America. He became a supporter of American independence, and he often spoke out in favor of the colonies. He did not make himself well liked amongst the ruling classes. His chance of building a political career, though, was damaged, as I said, because he had the habit of criticizing everybody. He was just as likely to attack the opposition spokesman Charles Fox as he was to challenge Lord North, who was the Tory Prime Minister. And a general election was called in 1780, but things happened. And this is what happened. You see, in 1779, Lord George Goulden organizes and heads up the Protestant Association, and he is fighting against what has been known as the Papist Act of 1778, which allows a modest amount of flexibility to Roman Catholics, allowing them some civil rights as long as they swear an oath of loyalty to the Queen, or to the Crown, rather. On the 2nd of June, 1780, Lord George heads a crowd of about, it's estimated, 50,000 people, and they march in procession from St. George's Fields in Southwark across the river to the Houses of Parliament to hand in a petition against Catholic emancipation. They threaten to force their way into the House of Commons, but they reassemble soon afterwards, and over several days, they destroy a number of Roman Catholic chapels. They pillage the houses of Roman Catholics. They set fire to Newgate Prison. They broke open the other prisons and let out the prisoners, and they attacked the Bank of England and other public buildings. The army eventually is brought in, the Riot Act is read, and the army killed or wounded around 450 people before order was restored. For his role in instigating the riots, Lord George was charged, as you would, with high treason. Somebody famous encouraging people to break into Parliament, and no, it could never happen again, could it? No. He's relocated comfortably imprisoned in the Tower of London. He's allowed to receive visitors, including the famous Methodist preacher, Reverend John Wesley. Thanks to a very strong defense by his cousin, Lord Erskine, he's acquitted on the grounds that he had no treasonable intent. As the proverb says, there's nothing new under the sun. In 1786, he's excommunicated by the Archbishop of Canterbury because he will not be a witness in an ecclesiastical case. And in 1787, he's convicted of defaming Marie Antoinette, the French ambassador and the administration of justice in England. He just doesn't care who he insults. He was permitted to leave the court without bail, unusual, but he didn't appear the next day. And he escaped to the Netherlands, but following representation by the French court at Versailles, he was commanded to leave the Netherlands and return to England, eventually being discovered hiding out in Birmingham, where he then decides to convert to Judaism. The chief rabbi at that time, David Schiff, wouldn't even give him house room. But the great synagogue would have nothing to do with him. But a breakaway synagogue called the Hambro, and we'll talk about the breakaway synagogues of London on another occasion. The Hambro had no problems at all. There was a Bruigus. So aged only 36, he fully converts to Judaism, undergoes a circumcision, Brit Milah, and that is taken on at the 7 Street Synagogue in Birmingham, which is next door to Singers Hill Synagogue, currently Singers Hill Synagogue in Birmingham. And he takes on the name of Yisrael ben Avraham Goulden. He becomes a ger tzedek, a righteous Gentile, a righteous convert. And he lives with a Jewish woman in an area of Birmingham called the Froggery, which was a really marshy area, which is now under what is New Street railway station. There's no evidence, of course, of the house he lived in now. Some months later, in January 1788, they finally catch up with him in Birmingham, although he wasn't hiding, but communication was very poor. And he was arrested, except this wasn't the Lord George Gordon of the House of Commons. This wasn't the Lord George Gordon of the Gordon riots. They found a man shabbily dressed as a Polish Jew with a long beard, a kaftan, and a black broad-rimmed hat. And you see in front of you a picture of him. And he gave his name as Israel ben Avraham. He wouldn't accompany the officers of the court because he wouldn't be seen in court on a Shabbat. But a magistrate got out of bed and ruled he must be compelled to travel. And so, with carrying a package of kosher food for the journey supplied by his landlady, he was unceremoniously transported to London and sentenced to 5 years imprisonment with some additional harsh penalties. And he was sentenced to be kept in Newgate prison, which was notorious. Whilst in prison, he lived the life of an Orthodox Jew. He adjusted his present life, put on tzitzis and tefillin every day. He fasted when halacha required it. He celebrated the chagim, these festivals. He was given kosher meat and chalot and wine by the prison authorities. And they allowed him to have guests of a minyan of visitors to come in on Shabbat to make a minyan for davening. He put a mezuzah on his door. There was a plaque of the 10 Commandments, which was hung on a peg in his cell wall on a Shabbat. So it made the room into a sort of a mini shul. Gordon associated only with Orthodox Jews, and he was so passionate about his faith, he refused to deal with any Jew who he felt did not keep the mitzvot, the commandments. Although any non-Jew who wanted to visit Gordon in prison, and there were many, were welcomed. he asked that the prison guards admit only Jews if they had beards and wore long black coats and had a head covering. He would often, keeping up the idea of chesed, he would go from cell to cell, looking after the non-Jewish prisoners, seeing if there's anything he could do to help them and provide them with some sort of sustenance. And also, he was an accomplished violinist. He would play the violin to sort of give them some little light relief. And what little money he got, he would give away to those in need. Here's the even weirder bit. On January the 28th, 1793, his sentence expires, but he had to go to court to make the claim that he would behave appropriately in future. When he appeared in court, he was ordered to remove his hat as he was in court, and that was the tradition in the Church of England and the courts. He refused. Somebody then takes the hat off his head. He then pulls out his nightcap, which he still has in his pocket, sticks that on his head, and takes a big handkerchief, wraps it round, ties it under his chin so they couldn't get it off. And he said it was in support of the propriety of the creature having his head covered in reverence to the Creator. He reads a statement, and this is a cartoon showing the statement, in which he claimed that he had been imprisoned for 5 years amongst murderers, thieves, etc., and that all the consolation he had arose from his trust in God. Now, his brothers, the 4th Duke of Goulden and Lord William Goulden, and his sister, Lady Westmoreland, offered to pay his bail to get him out of prison, but he refuses to go. He says that it would be a confession of guilt. And so he was returned to Newgate Prison. In October, he catches typhoid fever, which is rampant in the prison, and many prisoners were waiting outside his cell to hear news of his health. Friends, regardless of the risk of infection, stood out in the room saying to heal him, but George Yisrael Ba'avraham Goulden died on the 1st of November, 1793, at the age of just 42. Apparently, it's alleged while saying Adon Olam. But amazingly enough, because they were worried about the gravestone being desecrated, the Jewish community wouldn't allow him a Jewish burial, and he was buried at the burial ground of St. James's Church, Piccadilly, which happens to be in Camden, some distance away. And amazingly, as far as I'm concerned, some pennies were overstruck with a likeness of Lord George, and in fact, you can see his name, Lord George Goulden, on the penny, and that was a mark of some respect by just the regular people in the world, certainly in Britain. A very brief diversion, if you like, to Cento in Italy, where Benjamin Disraeli's father came from. He didn't come from there. His grandfather came from. Benjamin Disraeli's grandfather was called Benjamin Disraeli, but he'd moved from Italy and his father, Benjamin Disraeli's only son, Isaac, was born in Enfield in North London, which was then a very sleepy little village. He had his education not in England, not in Italy, but actually Leiden and in the Netherlands. And at the age of 16, he began his literary career, something I didn't know much about. He wrote and corresponded regularly with Dr. Samuel Johnson, of the dictionary and other things. He became a frequent table guest of publisher John Murray, and he was a bibliophile and wrote several books of literature and history, including The Life and Reign of Charles I. He trains as a solicitor. He marries a Jewish woman, Maria Bashevi, who came from another famous London Sephardi merchant family. And they have 5 children, Sarah, Benjamin, Naphtali, Raphael, and Jacobus. They were all named according to Jewish tradition, and all the boys had Brit Milah. But the Disraelis that's Isaac Disraeli, seemed to have a strange attitude towards religion. He had a running battle over 8 years with the Spanish and Portuguese synagogue over paying his synagogue fees or a fine for not doing something or other. And this antagonism got to such a state that after a while, and at the suggestion of his friend, the historian Sharon Turner, he had all his 5 children baptized. Not him, not his wife, his children. At the time, Benjamin Disraeli, who famously became prime minister, Benjamin Disraeli was actually at bar mitzvah age. Never had a bar mitzvah, but he did have a baptism. He's very odd to me. And he never, Isaac Disraeli, never ever felt not Jewish. There's a legend that he actually attended the inauguration of the Reformed Synagogue, the very first Reformed Synagogue in Burton Street in London, which is now the West End Synagogue. But we don't know that for true. It's a nice legend. But all we do know is that Isaac Disraeli, the Orthodox Jew who had his children baptized because he had a broigus with the community. I want to move on now to the Falmouth bit. Falmouth, a pretty little port in the southwest of England, in Cornwall, was actually a very important staging post for the trade across the Atlantic, the West Indies and the North American continent. And Falmouth had a Jewish community. It began with a man called Alexander Moses, known as Zender Falmouth, his wife, Phoebe, and they set up business as silversmiths in the area in about the 1740s. And he gathered around him a group of peddlers. It is really a nice little story. The group of peddlers, hawkers, if you like, a different word, they would start off on a Sunday. He would give them bits and pieces to buy from him, and they would then fan out and walk to little villages around the Falmouth area, selling their goods and wares. They had buckles and knives and pocket watches and things like that. Each of the peddlers would stay overnight at an inn, and because they would only eat kosher food, the innkeeper had a cupboard locked up with the peddlers' cutlery and crockery so that they wouldn't have to eat what everybody else was eating in the inn overnight. The peddlers would return to Falmouth on a Friday. One of their number, they all chipped in, and one of their number came home early, so that on a Friday, he would either, if he could, shecht an animal or buy fresh fish and cook the food for Friday and Shabbat. And then the whole cycle would repeat. Now, this is the second synagogue. The first one knocked down. This one is actually a listed building, grade 2 listed building. And this is the second synagogue in Geiling Street, and it overlooks the harbour. Now, you might think, oh, that's very interesting, but I want you to look at the windows. The windows, particularly the front ones, overlook the harbour. Why is it so important that they have such enormous windows? And the story goes that it was so that the merchants on a Shabbat could see which ships were coming and going into harbour, because as soon as Shabbat was out, they would go down to the harbour side and start buying the goods which were being brought in from the West Indies, from South America, from the North American colonies. So those, it's alleged, that's why the windows were so large, because they could get a jolly good view. Interestingly enough, Moses, Zender Falmouth's son-in-law was a man called Moses Jacob, and he took over running the congregation after Alexander Zender's death. He was a very Orthodox Jew. He never omitted mincha any day that he was traveling around. He even, it is alleged, trained his horse to stand still when Moses Jacob was saying the Amida, because of course you're not supposed to move when you say the Amida. He was sitting on his horse, he wouldn't get off his horse, but the horse stood still. And it was suggested that when it came to the end of the Amida and you're supposed to take 3 steps back, he had trained his horse to take 3 horse steps backwards just to fulfill the requirements of saying the Amida. I think is a nice idea, if a little bit balmy. Now, because Milim is based in Leeds, I did a little bit of research into the Leeds Jewish community, but there are very, very few records about the community, really only from the 1830s that it was established, and the numbers increased very slowly during the time period that we are looking at. In the 1841 census, there were only 9 identifiably Jewish families in Leeds, and a number of single men, probably no more than about 55 people. So that is not an indication of how at that time the Leeds community wasn't that important. Of course, it grew rapidly with industrialization. We know about that, and perhaps another time we can talk about that. But I don't want to do that. I don't want to talk about Leeds or Falmouth. I want to talk about this amazing man. This is Isaac Ikey Solomon. He was born in 1787. His father came from Würzburg in Germany, and he may well have been, the father may have been a dealer in stolen goods, what's known in popular English parlance as a fence. We know that little Ikey, Isaac, was selling oranges and lemons around Petticoat Lane from the age of about 8 or 9, and he may have fallen in with a gang of petty criminals, or he may not have had to fall very far because his father was a petty criminal anyway. He marries a Jewish girl called Anne or Hannah Julian on the 7th of January 1807 at the Great Synagogue in Duke's Place, and we've spoken about that before. She was the daughter of a man called Moses Gideon, who was a coachmaster in Aldgate. Excuse me. And that's going to be fairly important. Ikey runs a shop in Brighton, and then a jeweller's shop come pawn shop in Bell Lane in the east end of London, which is where the Jews Free School finished up being built. He used to carry on business as a receiver of stolen goods, and he was perhaps the most active in the trade in London. He was caught stealing a pocketbook in 1810 and £40 in banknotes, together with a man called Joel Joseph. And they'd attended a big public meeting outside the Houses of Parliament. And it sounds to me like they were doing a bit of pickpocketing on the side. They were caught. Joel Joseph tries to get rid of the £40 in banknotes by eating them, but Ikey is caught, and he's tried at the Old Bailey and found guilty of stealing. It's a felony. And he's 23 and he's sentenced to penal transportation for life in Australia. However, because of the Napoleonic War, they didn't have any spare ships going out that way. And he spent 8 years, next 6 years, it should have been 8 years, 6 years imprisoned in a prison hulk on the Medway called the Zetland. Then he's released by mistake. There's going to be a lot of mistakes in this story. He spends another 2 years in Chatham working in a business, returns to London in 1818 and sets up yet again as a dealer in stolen goods, a fence, and a pawnbroker. And he's arrested again 9 years later in 1827, and police charge him with theft and receiving the following stolen goods: 6 watches, 3.5 yards of woolen cloth, 17 shawls, 12 pieces of Valencia cloth, some lace, bobbinet, caps, and other articles. He's committed for trial and lodged in Newgate Prison, the notorious Newgate Prison. On a writ of habeas corpus, the jailers take Solomon to the Court of King's Bench. The application fails, and the guards lead him to a conveniently waiting hackney carriage, which is outside of the courthouse, on his way back to Newgate Prison. There were no such things as prison vehicles. You just took whatever had to be passing as a taxi. Unknown to his captors, however, the coach just happened to be driven by his father-in-law. They agreed a detour, whether ways or hadn't been invented at that time, I'm not sure, but the traffic looked a bit bad, and the coachman said, I know a good detour, and the prison guard said, okay, you know what you're doing, and they went down Petticoat Lane. That was a big mistake because there was a bit of a problem, and at a prearranged place, Ikey Solomon's friends jumped in the hackney cab, overpowered the guards, and released Ikey, who does, as they say in the business, a runner. He flees via rural Tottenham in North London, and he finishes up in going to Copenhagen, and then, amazingly enough, to New York in 1827, which is already, of course, part of the United States. His escape was prominent news throughout England, and they quickly focus their attention, the police, on his wife, and they arrest her and charged her with receiving stolen goods. She's found guilty. She's sentenced to penal transportation to Tasmania, I think then known as Van Diemen's Land, and the judge allowed his 4 younger sons to go with Anne on the trip. Doesn't seem much of a punishment, but there you go. The 2 oldest sons, and we'll come back to them in a minute, John and Moses, sailed separately to Sydney in Australia, not to be with their mother. And I can't work out why, but we'll come back to them in a minute. She sails on the ship the Mermaid, and she arrives in Hobart in June 1828. Ikey, lodged in New York, reads the papers and finds out that she has been transported to Australia and feels like he wants to join her. So he first takes ship to Tasmania, to Rio de Janeiro, and then he gets onto another ship traveling under the name of Sloman, but I think it's probably because whoever wrote the name down couldn't write down Solomon. And on the ship, traveling right around the Cape Horn and across the Pacific, there's another Jew, a German Jew trying to make his way in the world and deciding to make a new life for himself in New Zealand. And this time, ladies and gentlemen, this is 2 years before the British Treaty of Waitangi with the Maori peoples in New Zealand. So it really is not quite terra incognita, certainly not. The Maoris knew about it. But for settlers from Europe, this was a very unknown territory. Ikey is quickly recognized when he arrives in Hobart, but because his escape has made the headlines and he's a notorious fugitive. But amazingly enough, the lawmakers in Tasmania hadn't thought of that. There was no law to make him an arrestable person. What were they to do? So the Lieutenant Governor of Tasmania can't arrest him without a warrant from London. So he sends for a warrant from London. It's a 6-month voyage to get to London and 6 months to get back. In the meantime, Ikey Solomon opens a shop, and he's doing quite nicely. He opens a shop in the main street, Elizabeth Street in Hobart. And he also tries to ask for his wife, who is a prisoner, to be allowed to be sort of assigned to his household. She had become a servant to a police officer, but there'd been a bit of a broigus and a row, and she had been sent to the female house of correction. In the end, the Lieutenant Governor agrees that Ikey Solomon can have his wife join him, but he has to enter into a £1,000 bond of guarantee. It's a fortune, but he gets that money. And the bond is to assure that Ikey is not going to escape from Tasmania. And I ask, where's he going to escape to? Anyway, a year later, the warrant for the arrest of Ikey arrives aboard a ship, and immediately he's arrested and placed on board a ship to be sent back to England. Everybody in Hobart denounces it. The newspapers are dead against it. And it was such a state that the chief constable had to accompany Ikey on his voyage because the ship's master refused to guarantee his arrival. There was another trial at the Old Bailey. It was sensational. He was found guilty on only 2 out of 8 charges, but he was sentenced to be transported back to Tasmania for another 14 years. He comes back again in 1831. He's sent to jail where he becomes a trustee. He's released from prison. He tries to unite with his family, but Anne will have nothing to do with him. She gets her freedom. She's allowed to leave in November, and she disappears from the story. Ikey stays in New Norfolk in Tasmania, and he is given a conditional pardon in 1844 and full freedom in 1844. He gets his full freedom. He's actually involved in the growing Hobart Jewish community, and we know that because we've got records of a complaint filed to the Board of Management by the chazan of the community, Reverend Cohen, that Ikey had insulted him in public in the street. Amazingly enough, Jews College, as it was then, started in 1855. By 1856, only 2 Jewish communities had made any financial contribution to the upkeep of Jews College. I think one was Hull in the northeast of England, and the other one was Hobart in Tasmania, which I find amazing that the word had traveled around the world. He dies, so Ikey Solomon dies in 1850, and he's buried in the burial ground of the Hobart Jewish community. But what happened to his sons, you will ask? John and Moses lived in Sydney, and John particularly did very well, sufficiently well that he became involved in the growing Great Synagogue. And actually, it was John Solomon who funded the purchase of the land on which Sydney's Great Synagogue still stands, which I find as quite an amazing link in the chain. And just finally, ladies and gentlemen, a brief word about fish and chips. Traditional food. Everybody knows that the British love their traditional British fish and chips, only it's not British. You see, the Sephardi immigrants who came into the community in the 1650s from Holland would have brought with them fried fish, which they had fried in what they called pescado frito, which I think is Portuguese. My Portuguese isn't as good as it ought to be. Coated in flour and dipped in oil, fried in oil. This was different to the way that the English people would have been frying in lard or butter, which would have gone rancid over the Shabbat, even if you could eat it. And the fried fish could be eaten hot on a Friday night and cold for Seudah Shlishit. And we know that they were already talking about the Jews' way of preserving salmon and fish way back in a book in the 1780s. In Thomas Jefferson, in a letter, writes to a friend about having sampled, and I quote, fried fish in the Jewish fashion. Oliver Twist, written in 1838, we find Fagin, another time when Charles Dickens dips into the Jewish community. Fagin living in Field Lane, where there is a fried fish warehouse, and in the first edition of a cookbook called A Shilling Cookery for the People, gives a recipe for, and I quote, fried fish, Jewish fashion, dipped in flour, a batter, and water. Interestingly enough, the potato bit comes again through the Jewish links with South America, and the first imported by the Spanish in the 1570s via Madeira, where there was a thriving Jewish community. And of course, then to the Spanish Netherlands, and where many Jews were living. And that's how we got where we came in with Oliver Cromwell. King Louis XIV in France forbids the practice of Protestant Christianity. And many of the Protestant Christians, Huguenots we call them, about 10,000 we think, arrived, oh no, maybe more, maybe 100,000 arrive in Great Britain. And they settle where there are already Huguenot communities in Soho in central London and in the East End of London. around Petticoat Lane, Spitalfields. And they bring with them the idea of chipped potatoes fried together, and the Huguenots and the Jews managed together to provide us with fish and chips. The Huguenots built a lovely chapel, a beautiful chapel now, which when they left, the Jews took it over and it became the Machzige Hadas synagogue. And when the Jews left, it's now become a mosque, which I think is a fascinating recycling of a house of prayer. In 1860, so we just slid out of the Georgian period. In 1860, a Jewish immigrant from Eastern Europe called Joseph Malin, probably Malinsky or Malinov, but changed it, Malin, opened the first business in London's East End selling fried fish and chips, which until then you'd only found in certain Irish potato shops. In 1968, the National Federation of Fish Friers presented a commemorative plaque to be put on the shop or the restaurant of Malins of Bow, recognizing their founding role in the chippy business. And finally, once again, Charles Dickens has the last word. In his novel, A Tale of Two Cities, written in 1859, Charles Dickens writes what is believed to be the first reference to chips, and I quote, "husky chips of potatoes fried with reluctant drops of oil." And that, ladies and gentlemen, is my reluctant end of my talk. And I hope you've enjoyed it. And I'm now going to stop my sharing so we can all say hello to each other.
Well, thank you so much, Simon. That was a fascinating journey through some very interesting characters. If anybody has a question, please get it in the Q&A now. We have a couple of questions that are quite similar. Andrew Banks is interested whether Meyer Lyons was an ancestor of the later Lyons family. And also Sonny Koski wants to know if there are any descendants of the personalities you've mentioned today who might be of note. Okay, well, I'm going to be absolutely honest. I haven't found any link between Meyer Lyons and Lyons of Corner House fame, because of course that wasn't their original name. So I'm going to say no. And as far as I know, Meyer Lyons wasn't married, and he died in Kingston, Jamaica. That's the answer to the first question, I think. Yes. Yep. As for descendants, well, remember, an awful lot of Lord George Goulden didn't marry. A number of our personalities to begin with either married out or got their children married out, and so they would disappear completely from the Jewish community. And the Sephardi community, the Spanish and Portuguese community, can indeed trace their lineage back, way back. Some good friends of ours can actually trace their ancestry back to, if people know about Lemon Heart rum, the heart of Lemon Heart rum was a Sephardi Jewish family, I think, either from Plymouth or around there, and he can trace his lineage back to the originators of this delicious rum, which was, of course, made from sugarcane, I think. Interesting. Other questions? There's one from Sydney. I don't mean a person called Sydney. From Jana Bithlik. This is Jana from Sydney. I have a question about John and Moses Solomon. You have mentioned they purchased the land for the Great Synagogue. Perhaps it was the York Street Synagogue, because the land for the Great was purchased in 1871. Could you please comment? You could be right. My information was it was the Great Synagogue, and it could well have been purchased in 1871, because they would have been, by that time, perhaps in their 60s. And that would make sense too. They had enough money gathered by then. I remember this whole incident was in 1827, was 1828, 1830. So by 1871, they could have been older men and well established.
I'm going to be absolutely honest. I don't have the answer, and I'm not going to make it up if I don't know.
I think that was it. I'm not sure there were any more questions.
Lemon Heart Rum came from Penzance. Thank you. Thank you, Nigel. Oh, Nigel Margot. Hello, cousin Nigel, who I think is now living down in Penzance. Thank you. It was Penzance, but nevertheless, the hearts of Lemon Heart were these people, and they still living in Southgate. Naomi Cohen Jackson. Oh yes, Naomi Jackson. Yes. My goodness me, she was my old secretary. Lovely. Okay. Blah 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 blah. Oh, missed it. Okay, that's that. And Nigel's
brother lives in Penzance.
Sorry, Nigel.
So thank you so much for being our guest today. It's been a pleasure to have you, and to say thank you, we have a couple of gifts we'll send you. One is this book, Leeds and its Jewish Community.
Thank you.
It does have some scant mention of the period of time you've spoken about, so maybe there's one or two nuggets in there. And I'll also send you this, which is some of my photographs of Magen David Adom in action in Israel. I hope
my favourite charity of all, so that would be a really great one to have. Thank you very much indeed.
You're most welcome. Now, before we go, let me just tell our audience a little bit about the future programme, just a couple of events to mention. Next week on the 13th of December, the award-winning writer Roy Schwartz joins us from New York. He's taking us on a journey through comic book lore, American history and Jewish tradition when he asks, is Superman circumcised? Finally, for now, the following week, we welcome Timothy Shaffert to discuss his latest novel, The Perfume Thief. This is set in Paris in the months following the Nazi occupation and concerns a plot to steal the recipes of a noted Jewish perfumier. We have speakers booked well into next year, so please do visit our website at milim.org.uk, sign up for our newsletter there to ensure you don't miss anything. All of our events are free, but you can make a small donation if you wish to help with the cost of staging these webinars. There is a link in the chat now. It remains for me to thank our speaker, Simon Goulden, once again. Thank you so much, Simon, for being with us.
A pleasure.
And I'm looking forward to seeing you all at a future event. Until then, stay safe. See you soon.